Thank you all so much for joining me on stage today. I'm going to do quick introductions for the three of you, and we'll get started. So we're joined by Tony Brown, the CEO of Heart of Los Angeles. That's HOLA, OLA. Stanford's not the only one with good acronyms. Which aims to help young people overcome barriers through exceptional free integrated programs. And Tony is the co-founder of the Ola Eisner Intergenerational Orchestra, which brings together musicians from teens to adults of all ages to share in the joy of music making, and in which he himself plays the clarinet. Tony works to promote legislative and administrative policies, both state and federal, that enhance the quality and accessibility of after-school programs in California. Donna is the executive director of Generations United, whose mission is to improve the lives of children, youth, and older people through intergenerational collaboration, public policies, and programs for the enduring benefit of all. She was named one of the top 50 influencers in aging by Next Avenue in 2015, and that same year, under her leadership, Generations United received the Eisner Prize for Excellence in Intergenerational Advocacy. And Ernest Gonzales is an NYU James Weldon Johnson professor and director of the MSW program at the NYU Silver School of Social Work. And he's the director of NYU CHI, which stands for Center for Health and Aging Innovation. He's also a senior fellow of the NYU Aging Incubator, which brings together faculty and students from across the university who are involved in the study of aging and its impact on society. His work centers on productive aging, health equity, discrimination, and social policy. So again, thank you all so much for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you.
As Martha mentioned, we're here to talk about intergenerational innovation, which a couple things on that. First thing, when I hear the word innovation, I think of high tech or technology or high tech, which maybe that's just living and working in Silicon Valley. But we're here to talk about essentially just new and best practice ways of bringing generations together, which I think will mostly be intergenerational programming. And another thing is, why do we need to talk about intergenerational innovation in the first place, which perhaps everyone in this room doesn't need a super long explanation on that, but I'm bringing it up because I'm going to ask our panel to do a little bit of background on so I'm going to ask them each to talk about what they find to be innovative and effective intergenerational programs today. But looking back, sort of, this is essentially a problem of the last 100 years, which a lot of the issues of longevity that we've been talking about share that in common. But essentially, this is all a very abstract thought. But so, this is something that we've over 100 years ago, we didn't need to think about why we need to bring the generations together. That's what I'm trying to say. So, we've essentially had to innovate in order to bring generations back together because it's only a recent development that we live in an age-segregated society. So this is a question for the whole panel, but I'm going to aim it mostly at Donna, because you've been with Generations United for 25, 30 years. And Generations United does not actually create intergenerational programming of its own, but rather supports and promotes intergenerational programs. So you've seen sort of a trajectory over the last 30 years of perhaps when intergenerational programming was starting out and how it's developed. So I'm hoping you can share with us sort of what you've seen that trajectory be like over the last 30 years, and then what you have found to be most effective today.
Well, I wanted to start with gratitude. I was thinking before we came up here about I greet this day with a grateful heart. And I wanted to say thank you to Maria. I'm very grateful for all the preparation that you did to get ready for today. I was very impressed. I'm grateful to be up here with two absolutely wonderful partners, colleagues, and friends who are joining me for the final session of the 2-day conference. And I'm very grateful that you all stayed. And you're here. So I just wanted to be sure to share that, because the other thing I'm really grateful for is the growth in the field, is the interest in intergenerational work. And I've been very fortunate because I actually directed my first intergenerational program when I was 22, so well over 40, 45 years ago at the Salem, Oregon YWCA. And that was my introduction because my heart was always with teenagers. And it was a friendly visit program where we took high school sociology students to visit low-income, older, isolated adults. And I thought, oh, this program doesn't really matter. What we want to do is work and focus on the kids. But what I found were older adults that didn't get out of bed except for the day that their friend was coming, and students that skipped school except for the day that they were going to go see their friend, because they were both needed. They both had purpose. They had a reason to show up that day. And that's when I was first introduced to the power of bringing generations together. So with Generations United, we were founded over 35 years ago, and we were really founded to combat the growing efforts to pit generations against each other and to really fight over what people said were scarce resources. When in fact, our bookend generations, our oldest and our youngest, are the ones that hold our civil society together. And they're usually the ones that are left out. You're either too young and you're waiting to be, or you're too old and you're waiting to die. And so we really were focused and founded to really combat that people at every age and stage of life have value. But when I first came into Generations United, what we often heard about was how sweet and nice and soft and optional it was. And so much of our work has been elevating and validating and growing the intergenerational field. And I feel very, very grateful for what we've been able to do with that and what my colleagues around the country and around the globe have been able to do. So we've seen movement from some of that very passive tutoring, reading, one-way sort of service to people tackling very serious issues, whether it's tackling transition from foster care, whether it's tackling preserving stories that we're going to lose if it's not for someone who's capturing those, like with Atlantic City and the Voices of Atlantic City, where college students have interviewed civil rights activists about what their lives were like, whether it's really realizing that it's not just about connecting generations, it's about community. And I'm so excited about the fact that there's so much that's being consumer driven in terms of making our communities intergenerational, not multi-generational. We really don't need a curb cut for a wheelchair and a stroller. What we need is for that stroller and that wheelchair person to meet each other. So going from the multi, having a bunch of generations together, to the inter, where they actually connect and meet each other. And that's the growth that I've been very excited to see and to hear people here talking about. So thank you for everything that you're doing.
Yeah, I'm reminded of something you said. You're saying bringing the generations together, and I think, why is that beneficial? I'm reminded of, I think it was the Surgeon General of California yesterday who was talking about how the needs of the older and the younger often, the needs that serve young people to put them on a good trajectory are often the same needs that old people have to prevent things like Alzheimer's. So enabling this intergenerational interaction. And I want to follow up with something that we talked about before, where you mentioned that one of the most effective forms of intergenerational programming that you've encountered are intergenerational shared sites. And I was wondering if you could share with us a little bit more about that.
The intergenerational shared sites, I loved it once. I was meeting with somebody in the Bush administration and we were talking about this, and she looked at me and she said, "It's so duh." And I said, "Yeah, it is so duh." But some people, it's that intentionality that we're talking about. And with intergenerational shared sites, there really makes sense. It's saving dollars while making sense to use space and place to connect generations versus separating them and segregating them, which we've done through our programs and our policies. So it's a reweaving and reconnecting that we do. And an intergenerational shared site, and I'm so excited about the Eisner Prize and the Eisner Prize winner and some of the work that the Eisner Foundation has done to elevate this. But intergenerational shared sites are really about using a facility, a space, or a place to connect generations. And what we found during the pandemic, I'll give you one quick example, which I think really should resonate with all of us, which is we've heard so much about older adults being isolated and being locked off and by themselves, and that loneliness and the depression and everything that occurred. But if it was an intergenerational shared site, where it was may have been a senior care facility that also had a child care facility, had an after school program, it had some sort of interaction, even though the generations couldn't physically be together. There's one in Seattle where they put a GoCam in the child care center and they beamed it in all across the senior living facility so that the older adults could stay connected. They did window visits, they did postcards, they shared stories, they did outdoor parades. But it's all the ways that they stayed connected. What's really important is that their workers could show up for work because they had childcare on site. And so they showed up. They didn't face some of the attrition that others did. we know that people, workers in intergenerational shared sites have sort of the flip of the industry average. There's one in South Dakota where they have an 80% retention rate among their staff and a 20% turnover. And you don't hear about those numbers in the kind of traditional caregiving facility. So there's a lot of ways that they make sense, and we need to make them more possible because people want them.
Thank you. So Ernest, I know with the Center for Health and Aging Innovation, you were, would you call it a shared site?
I wouldn't go so far because I think there's a formalized definition for that.
Okay.
So you would probably look it up and say, no, not that. Yeah.
So, but you're working on an intervention that has to do with home sharing.
Well, home sharing, I'm not going to belabor the issue that housing is an important social determinant of health. We heard that so clearly articulated really nicely yesterday. I'll start by saying that's a hard nut to crack. When we have taken every step to try to bring generations together, for all of the important issues, social isolation, affordability of higher ed. I'm faculty at NYU, for heaven's sakes, we're quite an expensive school. When I am running into policy barriers at the municipal, the state, the federal level, you're dealing with a program that could have potentially huge impact, but it's going to take a while to get there. And just to give you a flavor, we've been hitting these policy barriers and cultural barriers. So policy barriers being, over this past spring, we had gone out into the community, libraries, senior centers, etc. Over 100 older adults showed up because they were interested in sharing their home with a graduate student. How wonderful is that, right? We almost have like 100 people here. 90% of them were in public housing, right? So just think of everyone that's sitting down. Major policy disincentive. Are you going to, if they receive an income from our students, they could potentially lose every benefit they worked so hard to gain. So that really breaks our heart. The issue of inclusion, the issue of racial diversity, 90% of them, the majority of them, racial ethnic minority individuals who've experienced cumulative disadvantages across their entire lifetimes because of structural racism. Gets me angry, right? And yet again, here's another institutional message that says, you can't participate in this potentially very beneficial program. So it leaves us with 10%, right? So we recruit the 10%. Were there other ways in which we could recruit older adults? With the support from Eisner, I've really built out a fabulous team in which we're recruiting older adults in a variety of ways. But what we're experiencing in New York City, we're not alone. And I'm so interested in circling back with Senator Smith from yesterday, especially because of her position on the Housing Committee. And we have colleagues in California and Portland who are all drafting legislation so then we could remove these policy barriers for further inclusion. An issue about cultural barriers. So our students, we have hundreds of students who are interested in this program. It really blows our mind. We actually stopped advertising towards our students because we can't meet the demand. The problem is that among the older adults that we were able to recruit as hosts, 2 out of 3 actually had negative stereotypes towards our graduate students, and not just NYU students, just graduate students, right? They thought graduate students were risky, partygoers, unreliable, unsafe, right? And I'm the director of the master's program. I see the range. And we do have some students that could be characterized as that. But the majority of our graduate students in nursing, medicine, public health, and law, and social work, they are so passionate about ending racism, about climate change, about, they are laser focused. And so it just boggles our mind. Here we have some graduate students, their stereotypes towards older adults, they have positive assumptions. Many of them were loved and cared for by their grandparents. And so they assume that they're, if they move in with an older adult, the housing is going to be affordable, safe, nurturing, a perfect place to study. Other students are just interested in gerontology and geriatrics, find it quite fascinating. Others, are appealed because of the affordability. So there's some cultural issues that we really have to tackle. We're launching a social media campaign specifically targeted towards older adults, because we know that stereotypes, those are plastic. We know how to move the needle on those. We know how to systematically dismantle them. So we're currently working on that right now. But just a flavor of policy and cultural issues that we're encountering.
That's right. Well, I'm glad you brought up Senator Smith, because I thought of her when she said yes, or I thought of you when she said yesterday how she received the feedback of social isolation being a personal problem, not a policy problem.
Right.
And I think, counterpoint.
Great idea, right? This is
also that stereotype about graduate students.
Right.
Just which ones are they thinking of?
I do know of a few.
Funny. Sure.
And as the director, I do have to dismiss a couple of students.
Yeah.
But it's not indicative of all of them. Yeah, for sure.
Well, I want to return, you mentioned a couple of items, particularly around, racism and ageism, and I think those two intersect. I want to come back to that. But first, I would love to hear from Tony and your effective intergenerational program. And you are, I would say, I sort of was like going with the theme of perhaps place-ish with these two, and quite differently with the Intergenerational Orchestra, a little bit focused on music.
Sure. Well, I think first things first, we have a place. So I run a place called Heart of Los Angeles. It's in the central LA area. It's one of the more densely populated areas west of the Mississippi. So that's something to know. There's not a lot of financial resource that's there when we talk about those who are living in the homes, many times multi-generationally, and having a hard time to afford enough space to live. So we have a park, and that's key to this question, I think, in general. We have a park that, for a lot of folks, if it felt safe, they'd use it as their backyard. They'd walk around with it, right? They bring a grandchild through in a stroller, they play on the equipment. And over years, we've been able to help make this park a lot safer through great programming. So during the after school time, we have now almost 300 young people going through our programs in music, orchestras, big bands, rock bands. And then we have visual arts, and then academic support, and then some counseling. But when we decided to build a new arts and recreation center in the park, I love what you said about making sure that we have a shared space that's inclusive of all. I realized that we couldn't just be an after-school program. We'd have to be a community-serving place for the variety of residents who live in the space. And so we built an intergenerational arts and recreation center. The next thing we would need to do is figure out, okay, well, what kinds of robust programming could we deliver? We had a history of delivering, college access programs. You might have someone from an elder in the community who may have put a son or a daughter through college, or a grandson or daughter, and maybe they're going to help the next generation of first-generation students to go to colleges and universities. That felt great. But I realized, gosh, I have almost 300 some odd students doing music. And then I also realized that in Los Angeles, in the city of LA, when you start going back generations, many of them had fairly robust music programs offered through public education in their schools, right? There were a lot of older folks I was meeting who said, oh, I used to be in the band at my, middle school, and then I went to high school and I played in the band and get a great, this program or that program. And then I would meet many of the teens that we get to serve, who the whole reason why we deliver 300 kids youth music programming is because in their schools they might be offered, say, a violin class in elementary, but then when they transfer over to or matriculate into the middle school, they no longer offer violin as an option. So their studies were interrupted there, right? The progression, or this happens a lot in middle school in Los Angeles now too. They have it in middle school, but then when they go to their high school, oh, sorry, no more orchestral music for you.
Tony, there might be a mic
you want
there.
to mic me up?
Did you turn on?
I did. I'll get a little help. Okay.
Good.
So all this to say, I thought, wow, this might be a really interesting opportunity to unify a generation of great folks who learned music most of their life, may not have played for the last 10, 15, 20 years, but loved music and had a great history with that, to young people who were so passionate once they had a little taste, and then they want to have more. So we created an intergenerational orchestra. So now we have the Eisner Intergenerational Orchestra, and I love it. I love it because, when we come to rehearsals, step one, we're all starting at the same place. We're about to go through a major challenge of learning a piece. No one's an expert, right? Because for the elders, we haven't played in 30 years. For the youngers, we haven't quite gotten to this level of music before. And so we're going to go through this semester, if you will, together to get ready for, say, our winter show. And it's pretty inspiring. I'm a third clarinet. For those of you who played in orchestra, you heard a first, you heard a second, and then there's me doing third, okay? Because I haven't played in 30 years. But I lean over to the person sitting next to me, Miles, and I'm like, Miles, remind me again, where's A? Right? And Miles, giggles and laughs and proudly shows me how to finger A. And it's just, I see how lit up he is, that he's teaching me something. And that is so rewarding for me, because I can actually rewind the clock in my own mind and realize those moments where I felt like, wow, I'm going to be something, or I have something that I can add value to. And it changes the sort of ageism dynamic, I think, of, oh, you're just a boomer, lecturing at me, right? I thought that was unfair, and of course I thought it was unfair that there were elders who I felt like there's still more I have to give. And you kind of seat everyone down and go through the process together. And it's just great to see the sharing going both ways. And so we've created, I feel like, a shared space to where, now we have 8-year-olds and we have 80-plus-year-olds, coming to utilize this center in a way that feels very much like community. And I think the other thing I've learned in this process so far is that it really, music is awesome. It's incredible. I'm so grateful to the Eisner Foundation for the Eisner Intergenerational Orchestra. But what I'm realizing is it's really just about music being a unifier to connect people and to have meaningful connection. And so I know we'll get into what's next, but that's a little tease.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. And I thought of you earlier when we were talking about, what sort of works for bringing generations together, and how we had talked about on our call last week that sort of this, it can be music, but it can be something else, that it's not necessarily about, here's people, come talk to an 80-year-old. Don't make it about that. Make it about this shared experience that, you both have something to give. So I appreciate that. So I want to come back to, this sense of connecting across, whether it be age or race or gender. When we talk about intergenerational connection, we're fundamentally talking about diversity, specifically age diversity, at least on the surface. But as we've already been discussing, these connections are also opportunities for integrating other forms of diversity, such as race, gender, class, ability. So Ernest, I'll direct this first part at you, but of course, conversation. So how did these sort of the associated isms, ageism, racism, sexism, how do they intersect? And what role do you see intergenerational programs playing in trying to end ageism and other forms of prejudice? So a very light question. I'm sure you can answer in 30 seconds.
Well, it's my belief that century after century, and it's not just here in the United States, but it's global. And it must just be something fundamentally, human about us, where we differentiate, we distinguish, and you take it a bit further, we discriminate. We create in-groups and out-groups like there are no end to that, right? So at NYU, we're trustworthy, we're loyal, we're authentic, but folks at Columbia or Stanford, right? So there's this in-group, out-group dynamic happening all the time. And, certainly we have what we now know, the contact hypothesis by Gordon Allport. It's really a powerful theoretical framework in which we could undo our intra and interpersonal assumptions about each other on a wide range of identities. And I had the really great fortune early on in my career to evaluate a national program called Vital Visionaries launched by Judith Salerno, funded by the National Institute on Aging. And it was this program that really brought medical students in contact with older adults, all to change medical students' mindsets about the health and well-being and the stereotypes about older adults. And 15 different cities, a rather large sample. I was so fortunate, talk about gratitude. I was just launching my career, and yet Judith and all of her team, she had been working on this project for about 10, 15 years. So I come onto the scene and at high levels of fidelity, it's ready to get evaluated. The program did precisely that. And when I assigned the medical students, here I am, a PhD student, but when I assigned the medical students homework, there was this really wonderful qualitative assessment in which the students said, prior to this intervention, if a 73 female Caucasian came to me and said that she had pain in her elbow, I would have immediately thought arthritis. But I met Betty, and I know that Betty actually plays tennis, and it's only pain in one elbow, in the arm that she plays tennis, right? That's tennis elbow. That is a clinically different diagnosis and approach to dealing with that pain. And what really the message that was sent was person-centered care. And I thought that's such a fabulous idea there. The interesting thing, and right now we're combing through the literature, hundreds of studies have implemented the contact hypothesis to end racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. We have not come across a single study that has taken ageism and racism, or two isms at once. So I'm currently calling this program Intersectional Intergenerational Interventions. It's the 3 I's. My husband says it's an awful name, but I think it sums it up. And I think that is really the next stage, where in such an age race, if we could really embrace each other and have empathy and gratitude and really build love. Do I dare say communities of love and understanding, especially after this past decade in which, it has been so, the civil unrest, the homicides, the suicide, it's just, we need to bring society back on the rails and see each other and realize we have so much in common. So I think this intersectional, intergenerational intervention is going to be quite powerful. So I'm excited about that.
I have to say that all of your eyes, my background is adolescent pregnancy prevention, and I used to have to be careful to not say intercourse as a part of that. So the eyes can really get to you. But what I was thinking about was we did a report several years ago called Out of Many One, Uniting the Changing Faces of America, because at the time people were talking about the fact that we had this demographic change underway, but they weren't thinking about the dual demographic change, which was that whole aspect that I think we're so much more aware of now, which is that we are so fortunate to have this older population that's mostly white and a younger population that's mostly of color. So hopefully we won't be like Japan, where it's going to be 70-year-olds taking care of 90-year-olds. We're going to have, this wonderful variety. But one of the programs that we came across that we elevated was out of Montgomery County, started by a minister, called Courageous Conversations. And what they did was that they took the older adults who had experienced adversity, whether they were Holocaust survivors or they had a child that came out before it was more acceptable to come out, all the different things they dealt with, and they paired them with students that were facing adversity. And they had these conversations. And what was so helpful was knowing that somebody survived, that people had been there before, that reassurance, and then for the older adults to be able to share that wisdom and the fact that they had been there. So I think those efforts and programs where we can bring generations together around, whether it's a topic or some sort of purpose, are so important to keeping our communities connected and to building stronger communities.
Actually, I want to turn to you, Joe. We want to do a quick time check. So I think we have, one last comment from Tony.
Okay, well, no, I love this. This is so great. I'm going to take just a couple quick seconds just to say, music's wonderful in this way. We can be very intentional, obviously, in a lot of areas. We can be intentional about the communities we outreach to join, the ensembles. And so we went in Los Angeles, we went into the Oaxacan community. It took a big hit most recently through our city council, as we know. We went into, South Central, as we went to Central LA, as we went to the West Side of LA, very different communities and pockets, many different nationalities, many different genders involved, and pronouns, all of it. It's been fascinatingly fun to bring this amazing group together that represents, I think, the diversity of the city, and have them go on a path to where now we're going to select repertoire that singles or highlights a variety of different groups that are featured. And we're going to allow people to share their voice and their stories about the significance of each piece. And we're going to learn from one another. So again, we're sort of all on this equal footing again together. And everyone, it's almost like creating a council, right? And everyone has a talking stick through the music that we select, through the process of learning the music and sharing it. And that too has been an incredible journey, but it has been extraordinarily intentional in design. We were not interested in heading on over to the West Side, where people had plenty of time. And we were also not interested in doing 4 days a week of, programming. It was going to be one night, right? Something that had the fewest amount of barriers possible to make sure that everyone could most likely feel inclusive and able to participate.